Let us pray. Eternal God, who shall abide in your tabernacle? Who shall dwell in your holy hills? You've given us the answers. Those who walk upright and work righteousness, who speak the truth in their hearts, will abide in your presence. Today, prepare the men and women of this body to dwell with you. Lord, give them the integrity to be true to their duties, always striving to please you. Fix their hearts on you, O God, that everything they think, say, and do will be under your lordship. Send your light and truth into this chamber as you guide our senators in these challenging times. We pray in your wonderful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 16, 2024, to the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Raphael G. Warnock, a senator from the state of Georgia, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patty Murray, President pro tempore.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of H.J. Res. 109, which the clerk will report.
Yeah, I pulled out mine. Yeah. You need to give, do you have an extra, or can I have the original? Yeah. Yeah, I did.
I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
We'll call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
It's concerning kills for that. Mr. President,
The Republican leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Twice in the last week, President Biden has suggested that inflation was 9% when he took office and claimed credit for bringing it down. The Washington Post gave him a rating of 4 Pinocchios for that very tall tale. In reality, inflation in January of 2021 was 1.4%. As of this month, prices have increased 20% since then. By one estimate, listen to this, the average U.S. household has to spend an additional $1,074 every month to keep up the same standard of living they had when President Biden took office. The numbers don't lie, and neither do the American people. They know nonsense when they hear it. A 32-year-old engineer from Nevada who voted for the president in 2020 told reporters he's frustrated with the way the White House frames the economy. Here's what he had to say. It's concerning to me when I keep seeing press come out of the White House where they keep saying the economy is good. That's really weird because I'm paying more on taxes, more on groceries, more on housing, and more on fuel. So that doesn't feel good. Small business owners in particular have been hard hit by increased prices. They have smaller margins to absorb the increased costs for materials, labor, and other operating expense. And they risk losing customers every time they raise their prices. One small business owner in New York, fourth generation roofer, reported, "We've increased more in the last 4 years than we did in 10. We don't have a choice." The owner of a small printing company in Washington state described painful price hikes as death by 1,000 paper cuts. He went on to say, "People are tired of price increases. We are tired of price increases." That's that. The American people are tired of price increases. They're tired of lies about it. And they're safe to say they're tired of Bidenomics. On another matter, this week, Putin is in Beijing, tending to what Russia and China have called a friendship without limits. But last week, it was President Xi who took to the road. And notably, his warmest welcome was in Budapest, Hungary. The visit from PRC's leader came as more of our European NATO allies are waking up, not only to the harsh reality of Russian aggression, but also to the linked threats facing Western security and prosperity to the urgent requirements of defense production, and to the particular challenge the PRC poses as a systemic rival. But Hungary, not so much. Viktor Orban's government has cultivated the PRC as its top trading partner outside the EU. It's given Beijing sweeping law enforcement authorities to hunt dissidents on Hungarian soil. It was the first European country to join Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, which other European governments, for example, like Prime Minister Meloni's in Italy, have wisely decided to lead. And Hungary has doubled down on Huawei after the previous US administration went to great lengths to encourage Europe to reject it. Hungary has let the PRC communications giant bake Chinese technology into the country's 5G expansion. Even as other European nations are paying vast sums to extract Huawei from their communications and infrastructure, Hungary is now home to Huawei's European regional logistics hub, a veritable gateway to the West. And last week, Prime Minister Orban's government signed 19 more agreements with the PRC, from transportation infrastructure to potential nuclear cooperation. A joint statement described the two countries' relationship as, quote, an all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership. That's between Hungary and the PRC. But the details of China's growing influence in Budapest should raise red flags for anyone seriously concerned about strategic competition with China. From across the Atlantic, there's good reason to appreciate a European government that's willing to question EU orthodoxy on things like short-sighted climate change policy or swim upstream in defense of conservative values. But here in Washington, we're obliged to evaluate whether allies and partners share our interests, not just our values. And whatever their pluck in dealings with EU bureaucrats in Brussels, Hungary's leaders have cozied up to America's greatest strategic adversary. Now, it's one thing that a latter-day Walter Duranty, who shields for Putin on Twitter, might also admire the only NATO member whose leader flies to Moscow to pay obeisance to the Russian dictator. But Hungary's willingness to serve as China's doormat to Europe, that part is tougher to square with the position of folks in Washington for whom singular focus on China has recently become an article of faith. The Democratic Party's increasing willingness to abandon Israel cries out for frequent and heavy doses of reality and harsh criticism. Unfortunately, so does this increasingly muddled logic on the threats facing the West from Russia and China. A NATO government that fawns over a Russian neo-Soviet imperialist, a European nation that rolls out the red carpet for greater predation, coercion, and espionage from a communist regime. This isn't where America should be taking our foreign policy cues. How about sending a high-profile diplomat and trade mission to Tehran? Hungary's voluntary legitimization of the world's most active state sponsor of terrorism. I don't think conservatives had any time for those who suck up to Iran. Maybe aligning with autocrats is in Hungary's interest, but let's return from Budapest and discuss what's in America's interest. America has an interest in strong allies who are willing to pull more of the weight of collective defense in the face of threats from Russia, Iran, and China. And we could have welcomed 2 more such allies to our ranks much sooner, if not for Orban's obstruction of Sweden and Finland's access to NATO. Not only do these countries have robust defense industries and capable militaries, they also each have companies that offer safer alternatives to Chinese 5G technology. And while many of us in Washington were urging the EU to do more to support Ukraine, Hungary was blocking greater EU burden sharing. Frankly, Mr. President, Hungary stands at the crossroads of 3 powers bent on undermining our security and prosperity. And the Orban government is modeling what not to do in the face of these challenges. My message to America's European allies has been the same, no matter their politics or their culture. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are working together to undermine us, and we need to move faster to rebuild the hard power we need to deter and defeat aggression and hold one another accountable to share the burden of collective defense. There's plenty of work left to do on this front. Now, one final matter. Earlier this week, I discussed the growing problem of BDS, that is BB derangement syndrome. Of course, there's an older and similarly noxious form of BDS, the boycott, divest, and sanction movement. This other BDS has been incubating on college campuses for the last decade, and right now making news at Harvard. This is unfortunate, but at this point it shouldn't surprise anyone. Remember, Cambridge, Massachusetts was ground zero for the current wave of anti-Semitism sweeping so-called elite education. Not to be outdone by the restorative justice being meted out by their rival to the south, Princeton, Harvard leaders have announced their own sort of amnesty for the Hamas-supported radicals who have harassed and intimidated fellow students in recent months. In exchange for dispersing from Harvard Yard the interim president and the dean will be meeting with the Crimson Red Guards, quote, to hear their perspective on academic matters relating to longstanding conflicts in the Middle East. The interim president also acknowledges, quote, the profound grief people feel over the effects of the ongoing war. And the campus Hamas sympathizers will also receive a meeting with a top official from the Harvard Corporation to address questions about the university endowment. Boycott, divest, sanction. BDS. It seems that the lesson at our country's oldest university is this: lawless radicalism works. Perhaps it's time for the American people to boycott, divest, and sanction the Ivy League. Just have the court.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
The Republican whip.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this week is Police Week, a week to honor our nation's law enforcement officers. These men and women have had a challenging few years. Unsurprisingly, calls to defund the police and attacks on the vital work that they do left a lot of officers discouraged and demoralized, even as they were asked to shoulder the same burdens with less support. Fortunately, Mr. President, I think time has started to provide a corrective. As we've watched crime take a toll on American cities, I think governments and individuals are more and more remembering just how much we need the men and women who bring order and safety to America's streets. And I hope and pray that we are coming to this week with a greater appreciation for the essential work that these men and women perform. I said essential, Mr. President, and they are. But let's remember something else as well. Police officers aren't just necessary, they're noble. They sign up for a heroic line of work, for a job that asks them to get up in the morning and go out and put themselves in danger to keep the rest of us out of it. And that asks them to do that day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. And they do it willingly, gladly. And when they're not doing the big things, Mr. President, the hard, heroic work of confronting dangerous situations and individuals, you can frequently find police officers doing the little things as well. Speaking to a school class, helping out a stranded motorist, buying shoes for a child in need. Police officers don't just defend our communities, they play a vital role in building them up. Mr. President, I'm particularly grateful for our law enforcement officers in South Dakota who work so hard in communities across our state. They've shared challenges faced by other police departments across the country over the past few years, including dealing with deadly drugs like fentanyl coming over the border and making their way around the United States. And they face some specific South Dakota challenges. I'm also deeply grateful for the Capitol Police here in Washington, D.C., who spend their days ensuring members of Congress, our staffs, and the many visitors to the U.S. Capitol building can go about their days in safety. And Mr. President, I am grateful to their families. Having a husband or wife, a dad or a mom, who is a police officer is not always an easy thing. Knowing that your parent or spouse may not come home from work one day is a difficult burden to carry. And in this police week, as we contemplate the service and sacrifice of our nation's police officers, it is important to remember the service and sacrifice of their families as well. Mr. President, before I close, I want to mention the heroic service of Moody County Chief Deputy Ken Prorock of South Dakota, who was killed in the line of duty in February of this year. And I just want to read a couple of lines from the Officer Down Memorial page on Chief Deputy Prorock's actions. I quote, "Chief Deputy Sheriff Ken Prorock was struck and killed by the driver of a vehicle being pursued by the Madison Police Department at 4:12 p.m. Chief Deputy Prorock responded to the call for assistance and was deploying spike strips at South Dakota Highway 34 and 472nd Avenue in Coleman. The driver intentionally swerved toward Chief Deputy Prorock, killing him," end quote. And Mr. President, the line that stands out for me the most in that memorial is this: Chief Deputy Prorock responded to the call for assistance. He heard a call for help, and he went to answer it, knowing full well that he could be placing himself in danger, up to and including the loss of his life. But he went anyway. That, Mr. President, is the heroism of Chief Deputy Prorock. And it is the heroism of all the men and women across our country who serve in our nation's police forces and who, when they hear a call for help, go out to answer it. Mr. President, may God richly bless all the men and women who serve our nation as police officers, and may He protect them as they stand on guard for us. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President,
The senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you. We're about to hold a vote under the Congressional Review Act The CRA was passed in 1994 to give Congress a 6-month window of 60 legislative days to review an agency rule. And if Congress doesn't like that rule, 60 days to overturn it. However, our vote today is not a vote on a notice and comment rule. In fact, our vote today is on something that doesn't even have the force of law. Our vote today is on a staff accounting bulletin issued by the SEC back in the spring of 2022. Now, the SEC has issued these bulletins, they're called SABs, for nearly 50 years without anyone ever suggesting that they were subject to the CRA. The CRA has a time limit for a reason, so that settled law is settled law, something that everyone can count on. And the CRA is limited to agency rules so that a single member of Congress can't tie up agencies and Congress with expedited procedures under the CRA by raking over the details of every agency action. Today's vote, coming more than 2 years after the SEC wrote the bulletin and applying to a staff bulletin rather than a rule, is far outside the scope of the CRA. We should not be holding this vote, and all by itself, that is a good enough reason to vote no. But let's talk about the substance of this SAB for just a minute. Fairness of our markets depends on transparency. Investors in pension funds and 401ks and workers who are trying to save for retirement all have a right to know what they are investing in. Securities and Exchange Commission is the guardian of those financial disclosures that give investors information about a company's business plan, about its leadership, and about the risks that it faces in the market. So to help public companies disclose information about their business in a consistent way from one business to another so that investors can make comparisons, the SEC issues staff accounting bulletins, these SABs, to clarify guidance about emerging issues in the accounting industry, how to tell people about this business. SAB number 121 was published to provide accounting guidance to companies that hold customers' digital assets. It says that because of some of the unique technological and legal risks associated with digital assets, public companies that safeguard crypto assets for their customers should make the risks associated with holding those assets visible to investors. One way that this risk shows up is that if a company safeguards property for someone, just an ordinary company is holding property for someone like stocks or bonds or jewelry, the company bears the risk that the property could be stolen. And that is why companies that hold property for others carry insurance, and it's why they have really big safes. But if the company safeguards crypto, there is a special risk that's not there with other kinds of property. Crypto can get hacked. In fact, there have been some pretty major crypto hacks in which assets just vanish. The risk isn't theoretical, it is real. FTX, $600 million, poof. Binance, $586 million, poof. Ronin Network, $625 million, poof. And Poly Network, $611 million, poof. All in just the last 3 years. We have seen multiple hacks of crypto platforms. The unique risks of crypto can create liabilities that seriously impact a company's financial condition. SAB 121 simply clarifies how companies should account for those risks in their financial disclosures. That's all it's doing. Now, there's a second kind of problem with crypto, and that is if a company safeguards property for someone, stocks, bonds, jewelry, like we talked about earlier, if the company doing the safeguarding goes bankrupt, the true owner of the stocks or the bonds or the jewelry can get their property back. But if the company that goes bankrupt is holding crypto, the peculiarities of crypto ownership and possession mean that the creditors of the bankrupt company could keep the crypto. The true owner may just be out of luck. Once again, SAB 121 simply clarifies how companies should make clear those risks in their disclosures. So let's talk for just a minute about what SAB 121 doesn't do. It doesn't bring customers' crypto assets onto a crypto platform's balance sheet or make the platform the owner of a customer's digital assets. Instead, SAB 121 requires disclosure of what other substantive laws, including bankruptcy laws, are already doing. This effort to reverse the SEC's accounting guidance would deprive investors of accurate information on the risks of holding crypto assets and corrode public trust in our financial system and our institutions. The vote today is about ensuring that the SEC is able to issue guidance that will help companies of all sizes produce strong, consistent, timely, and meaningful accounting disclosures. It's about protecting critical informational tools that investors and companies have relied on for half a century. And it's about maintaining the integrity of our markets, which relies on a clear, consistent accounting rulebook. Democrats should stand with President Biden against this effort to attack the SEC's authority. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. President,
The senator from Wyoming.
I move to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
I further ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak in favor of my Congressional Review Act resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 59, and its House companion, House Joint Resolution 109, a joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 U.S. Code of the rule submitted by the Securities and Exchange Commission relating to Staff Accounting Bulletin Number 121. Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, or SAB 121, is a rule under the Administrative Procedure Act, disguised as an accounting guidance. It was published by the SEC staff without the approval of the majority of the commission. Accounting guidance is not something that normally would catch the attention of Congress. But in this case, a bipartisan group in the Senate and House has uncovered serious concerns with SAB 121 and the actions of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Nearly 2 years ago, I started this process by sending a request for a legal opinion on SAB 121 to the Government Accountability Office. That office found that SAB 121 is in fact a rule and subject to the Congressional Review Office. Shortly after this finding, I introduced the Senate resolution to overturn this guidance in the Senate, and Congressmen Mike Flood and Wiley Nichols introduced the House companion. I congratulate them and House Financial Services Chair Patrick McHenry on the strong bipartisan passage of this resolution in the House. Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 puts consumers at risk by requiring a covered institution to place consumer assets on its balance sheet. It gives creditors a way to claim those assets in the event of a bankruptcy. We have seen how this plays out for consumers. Their assets are frozen for months or even years while the bankruptcy plays out. In some cases, they lose their assets entirely. Now, they've entrusted these assets to the custodian. It is the custodian that is in bankruptcy, and yet their assets are the assets that are at risk. So this does not protect consumers at all. Under SAB 121, the ownership of more than $100 trillion in assets placed for safekeeping with America's custodians are in jeopardy. The safest place for digital assets is in a self-hosted wallet, but not everyone can custody their own digital assets, including institutional investors that the SEC requires to use a qualified custodian. Regardless of what each senator thinks about digital assets, they should want consumers and institutional investors to have the option of placing their assets in the safekeeping of prudentially regulated institutions. Unfortunately, Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 prevents this by placing customer assets on the balance sheet of the custodian. SAB 121 also means that capital requirements apply. Banks would have to hold as much as $1 of capital for every dollar of customer assets. As much as the SEC would have you believe otherwise, the bank regulators have no discretion on this point. Banks must follow U.S. generally accepted accounting principles when calculating capital requirements. Finally, SAB 121 demonstrates how the SEC will push forward its regulatory agenda at the cost of transparency and the stakeholder input that is required by law. The Senate could have avoided this if SEC Chair Gary Gensler was willing to direct staff to revise Accounting Bulletin 121 to keep customer digital assets off the balance sheets of custodians and engage in a transparent process. Refusing to revisit this policy after bipartisan criticism is odd. The majority of the SEC staff accounting bulletins from the last 30 years have been revisions and rescissions of prior guidance. Revisiting and fixing accounting standards, especially when there's a new technology, is warranted and encouraged. Guidance is meant to be flexible. It is not meant to set policy, which would require notice and comment by those that will be regulated pursuant to that regulatory process. But apparently, Chairman Gensler would rather politicize accounting standards to achieve policy goals in the banking industry, an industry I'd like to remind him he does not regulate, rather than conduct a transparent policy-making process. Maybe it's because Chairman Gensler knows that putting customer assets on the balance sheet is bad policy that would garner enough support to finalize a rule, or rather would not garner enough support to finalize a rule. Maybe it's because he's committed to an ill-informed and unworkable fight against the digital asset industry at any cost. Unfortunately, SAB 121 does nothing to protect consumers, nothing to protect consumers. It hurts them. I hope that all of my colleagues will recognize this and join me in voting in support of House Joint Resolution 109. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the joint resolution is considered read a third time. The question occurs on passage of the joint resolution. Is there a sufficient second? Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Carden, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Casey, Collins, Cornyn, Fisher, Grassley, Lummis, Marshall, Peters. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Markey, Ossoff, Padilla, Warren. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson. Aye. Miss Butler. Miss Butler. No. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch. No. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray. No. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders. No. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney. Aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo. Aye. Mr. Vance. Mr. Vance. Aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Fetterman. Mr. Fetterman, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock. No. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton. Aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner. No. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell. No. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun. Aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mrs. Britt. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Rish. Mr. Rish, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Carden. Mr. Carden, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Sarono. Ms. Sarono, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Langford, Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Mullen, Mr. Mullen, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Schumer, Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 60, the nays are 38. The resolution is adopted. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the judiciary, Kamala C. Thieler of South Dakota to be United States District Judge for the District of South Dakota.
There will now be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided.
President.
Senator,
Mr. President, I rise today, along with my colleague from South Dakota, Senator Rounds, in support of the nomination of a distinguished South Dakotan, Judge Kamala Thieler, who's been nominated to fill a vacancy at the U.S. District Court for the District of South Dakota. Judge Thieler is a South Dakota native and a graduate of the University of South Dakota School of Law. She's been a judge for the South Dakota 2nd Judicial Circuit since 2018. Prior to her current role, she served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of South Dakota from 2012 to 2018, and before that, she spent time at 2 South Dakota law firms. When she's not trying cases, she often welcomes students to the courthouse, where she gives tours and conducts mock trials to help teach them about the legal system. Mr. President, I believe that Judge Thieler's experience and record will make her an excellent district judge, and most importantly, I believe that she has the character and impartiality to serve a lifetime appointment on the federal bench. I'm proud to support her nomination, and I encourage my colleague to confirm her as a judge for the U.S. District Court for the District of South Dakota. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President. Senator from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am pleased to join Senator Thune today in supporting the confirmation of Judge Kami Thieler. Ms. Thieler is a native of my home community of Pierce, South Dakota, and has an impressive list of career experiences spanning from the U.S. Attorney's Office to teaching at Dakota Wesleyan University to her work now as a state circuit court judge. It is because of her commitment to upholding the law, along with
the bill passes. We passed. Good news. Now it goes to the president's desk, and we are going to talk about that in the 2 o'clock live stream this afternoon. Give me about a half hour, 45 minutes. I'll be back for this afternoon's live stream, and we're going to recap this. We're going to cover it. So make sure you're here for it, guys. Don't be late. Bill passed. One more step forward, guys. Gary Gensler, probably snapped a wrist trying to punch a wall or something like that today because he's so frail. So anyway, guys, I'll see you guys in about 45 minutes. Don't be late.